morning.
Yes,
10:30?
I'll be recording 10:30. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
We're not meeting or with different.
So everyone knows your mic's live here.
All right, so, we already have the testimony, but I would like you to tell the board how we must pass.
Kevin, can you test?
Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
That's a little bit, yeah, that's better.
Well, it didn't work for one. I don't know why.
Is there any way to tap down the hearing board audio?
Is that what it is?
Thanks. Thank you.
I talked, but you're trying to figure out.
Good morning for everyone who's joining us right now. We're gonna wait a little bit for our attendees to come over or join the meeting. We're still a couple minutes out. Good morning, Chair.
Good morning. I'm just listening in this today. Here to answer any questions if you have them with me.
Thank you.
You have any suggestions for the topic you want me to tee up as far as any direction to go in?
I would say, yeah, but what?
I have a long list. That's why I'm curious if you have
Yeah.
a shorter list to,
I have a feeling we're gonna TT, right?
Oh, sure.
Like we are with the rule
Okay.
discussion.
I can
So,
generically bring it up.
yeah, I think so. I think we'll start and then, see where it takes, the discussion takes us.
Sounds.
All right, I will jump into housekeeping right now. So, good morning and good morning, and thank you for participating in our hybrid meeting for the South Coast AQMD Permit Streamlining Task Force Subcommittee. We have 3 formats for participation: in person, the Zoom app, and teleconference. Please silence your other communication devices to prevent disruptions during the meeting. In-person attendees must not connect to Zoom or teleconference while in the meeting room. All participants on Zoom, except for subcommittee members and South Coast AQMD staff, will be placed on mute by the host. You will not be able to mute or unmute your line manually. After each agenda item, public comment will be taken. For those of you in the room, you will be called upon when it's your turn to speak. For those on Zoom, if you would like to make public comment on the Zoom screen, please check the raise hand button. And for those calling in by phone, you can dial *9 to signal that you would like to comment. Your name and part of your phone number will be called when it is your turn to comment, and the host will unmute your line automatically. Speakers may be limited to a total of 3 minutes for all the items on the agenda and 3 minutes or less for public comment. The meeting chair may provide a shorter length of time depending on the number of requests to speak to allow everyone an opportunity to be heard. A countdown timer, if utilized, will be displayed on the screen for each public comment. Please note you can hang up and leave the Zoom meeting at any time. As far as decorum, please adhere to the speaker time limit and treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being dropped from the meeting. Lastly, please be aware that this video conference is being recorded. By participating in this meeting hosted by South Coast AQMD, you agreed to authorize recording of audio and visual content presented during this live event and consent to the subsequent use of the recording in the public domain by South Coast AQMD. A couple other items before I conclude housekeeping remarks. For those of us who are joining in person, if you do need to use the facilities, those are by the lobby. And if there is an evacuation, please follow staff orderly out to the parking lot. So that does conclude the housekeeping remarks. We'll bring the meeting to order. And if Rola can please do roll call for our members.
Good morning, everyone. Bill Lamar,
Bill Lamar here.
thank you. Bill Quinn,
Bill Quinn is here.
thank you. Bill Pierce,
Here.
thank you. David Rothbard,
Here.
Judy York, absent for now. She's on her way.
All right. So Judy will check in when she gets here, but I think we can jump in. We do have a robust agenda. These are intended to be discussion items. We do have some presentations, but no, items to present, information to present, but no accompanying slides. So the intent of all of this is to discuss these items. We will be starting with CEQA as it relates to permitting and things in the engineering and permitting division has been looking at. For item 3, we are going to continue our rule discussion from last time because we did run into time considerations for last meeting. Then we'll briefly touch on what we're looking at for implementation for 317.1 on the permitting side, very briefly, so we can start to get ahead of that workload and answer questions. So we'll touch on that and answer any questions. And then lastly, number 5, I will admit, is a very broad topic that Mr. Rothbard will be introducing. We'll see how much discussion we can get through today. With all these items, if it generates more discussion, we can always bring it back to future task force. But I think there's a lot of topics we can touch on under this permit condition. So again, we'll see where the discussion takes us. But with that, I think let's jump into our task force members don't have anything we wish to speak up front. I think we can jump into our first agenda item. All right, with that, joining us today, Dr. Jillian Wong will be presenting what we've been working on with CEQA as it relates to our permitting process and requirements, considerations we're contemplating or been implementing there. And also joining us today is our Assistant Deputy Executive Officer, Michael Kraus, from our Planning and Rules Development and Implementation Division, who will be here for the first few agenda items. So with that.
All right. So as you know, prior to issuing an air quality permit, CEQA is one of the requirements that we have to meet. And South Coast AQMD takes the role of either a lead agency or responsible agency for these permit actions. And so, we've heard the concerns regarding timelines and how the CEQA process can sometimes derail permitting, add to timelines. And so one of the things that we did do is take a look at our inventory to better understand, where we see some opportunities to streamline the process, to have things be laid out front. And I think, a couple of items that we came up with was one, definitely we asked for early consultation. Now, and that means projects, if you know that we are a responsible agency, we ask that either the lead agency reaches out to us to talk about consultation on the project, maybe what the document being prepared is, air quality analyses to give us a chance to weigh in early on. That way we do not have to, submit a comment letter during the process. We can get all of our comments, emission calculations, everything up front, and then that will help, that CEQA process move along. The other part that I think from the permitting standpoint is asking that permit applications are not submitted until CEQA documents. This is where we are not the lead agency until CEQA documents are out for public review. So that would be either, neg decks, EIRs. And where we see the streamlining aspect for us is that often through the public review process, projects can get tweaked. The things could change with regards to the actual project itself, which then affects the permits. So one of the ways that we were thinking is in order to streamline that, let's get that project description more settled, more set, so that when we get that permit application, we then have all the information to be able to move forward. Now, obviously, we do understand that there are special instances or circumstances, and we will look at it on a case-by-case basis. So, bottom line is we're asking for early consultation, come talk to us. We can do pre-application meetings, sit with you to better understand the project, where you are in the CEQA process, and then how we can integrate our permitting process in order to get you the permit in time for construction. So that was, what we wanted to tee up in terms of this topic. And then I'll turn it over to Mike Krause and let him kind of have his little intro spiel, and then we'll open it up.
Great. Just by way of reminder, the California Environmental Quality Act was passed in the state of California. It's a state law in 1970 under the then Governor Ronald Reagan. The idea was to sort of capture the environmental impacts from any projects that could have a physical impact on the environment. So this could be anything from a private project to a public project. But for us in this context, for the permit streamlining purposes, it specifically talks about projects that require a government approval. So this is how these kind of things fall into play. And that's kind of where, as Jillian highlighted, we cannot issue air quality permits if we haven't some kind of level of compliance with CEQA. And CEQA is a set law. I brought the book here just for fun for those that aren't there. Unfortunately, it's a 2023 book because now I have the 2024 at home. Okay. But nonetheless, it's a lot of law there, and it's a lot of fixed things, okay? We recognize that, right? So there's going to be mandatory deadlines. There's going to be certain requirements of what needs to be evaluated. There's going to be a public process. All of those things, unfortunately, we cannot change unless, of course, the state law changes. But those are the constructs we work in. But that's not all bad, because there are tools in our toolbox that I want to talk about. So there are various ways by which, we can look at a project and ensure that it still complies with CEQA, but yet streamline the process in doing so. Okay, to give you some examples, some of the projects might be, as you guys bring them in, might be considered exempt for us under CEQA, and there's a quicker route to move forward. There's also the ability to rely on previous evaluations. So this could have been done, let's say, by another public entity, another agency, and we can rely on those evaluations to ensure compliance with CEQA and issue the permit. There's also documents, of course, that we do, and they're not just ones that necessarily focused on your project. To give you some examples, in the recent years, as I believe the chair is aware of, that was some great idea was when we were working with the refineries on their refinery rule, we came up with the idea of, look, we're going to put all this time and effort and energy and resources, et cetera, into generating the CEQA document required for us to pass the rule. Let's get that document in shape to allow the permits in the future being issued by those refineries to rely on that analysis as well. Okay, so we did a big undertaking. We met with each of the major refineries on their specific projects, just what Jillian talked about. It was a lot of effort for them because they were having to make some of these or foresee some of these decisions that they might not have made at that point in time, but recognizing the importance of trying to get to those decisions as close as possible to get that evaluated in that document. So now the refiners are able to rely on that document and get those permits issued in a more timely manner than would have if they had to keep addressing CEQA each and every time they have those permit applications. We're currently looking at that as well in our Rule 1135. And so there's ways in which, again, there's other tools out there, tools in our toolboxes that we can rely on. Now, big question everybody always has, but what if the previous analysis and that previous document didn't quite cover all X, Y, and Z of our particulars of our project? Well, no worries there either, because CEQA also has an allowance of what they call an addendum. So we can basically add on those little areas that may not be, hopefully not significant, but can be add on that didn't quite get covered under the original previous analysis or document, and we can utilize that tool as well. So my bottom line is there's lots of tools out there that we can utilize realize lots of ideas that we can try to implement, and we have done in the past, and it has helped streamline, this process. I mean, I'll echo what Dr. Wong said about the idea of like early consultation, I would just call it awareness. Like when you're thinking of these projects, being aware of the fact that that is something that needs to get dealt with. I was going to say obstacle, hurdle, but I'm just going to back off from those words and like think of it more of like that's just another part of the checklist that needs to kind of be dealt with. And so early awareness of that then helps us kind of come up with ideas and pathways forward that will help streamline this process in getting you guys your permits sooner. I'm trying to think if there was any other stuff in there. As we kind of get down to it, when it also another tool that we have seen be utilized in the past is that if it does come down to your particular project needing a CEQA document, whatever that might be, or at the level of that analysis, actually little things like hiring a third-party consultant to work on those, because of course we have, limited resources here. And so that of course affects timing and stuff. Those are also helpful processes as well.
Thank you for that, Mike and Jillian. And I'll just add some things. Obviously, CEQA does fall under the planning division. We work very closely with them, as you can tell, and try to collaborate where we can. And this is, I think we've said this in past meetings, it's the streamlining through rulemaking. This has been very beneficial to take that route with 1109.1. Other rules, I think I won't identify which projects, but we have gone through permitting where CEQA has not been completed and just hit a wall and gotten stuck. And we cannot move forward until the CEQA issue is resolved. So lots of opportunities on that front. And then something else I wanted to identify before we open up is, so the contractors we have brought on board for engineering and permitting, one of the items we have tasked them with is working on CEQA issues, developing findings to support our engineers, freeing up our engineers' time and working on the CEQA aspects that Mike identified. We have limited resources, but this has been very beneficial and a huge time saver for us to put them on these projects and then ultimately get them to the finish line. So with that, would like to open up to our task force members for discussion. But first comments in the room with David Rothbart.
Thank you, Jillian and Mike. One thing, just big picture here, I'm a little confused. I don't do CEQA professionally, but I've been dealing with it for a while, so I have a general framework for what's required. The folks I represent, the public folks, usually do their own CEQA. They're the lead agency. And in that case, I'm not getting consistent feedback from people I represent or in my agency when we have a CEQA issue with permitting. One question I would have is, when you look at our CEQA document, there's a time frame in CEQA to provide comments. And I have seen a situation where the comment period is closed, but yet permitting has concerns about what's in the permit. And I think my understanding would be, as long as CEQA covers what the permit is supposed to cover, that you're not going beyond what's described in CEQA, that's all fine. But I don't know if that's consistently been implemented. I've seen some inconsistencies. So kind of my bigger picture perspective is it clear what you need to the permittee so everything's set so we don't have delays? Just big picture, do you see any kind of communication issues? Because I've seen some things that were some disconnects.
And I think I can start first and then I can weigh in. We have looked into that and I agree. I think there have been some disconnects and that's part of what we have been working on, is trying to give that consistency, right, to the regulated community so that there is an expectation of when you come in with that, what are we going to look at? What do we evaluate in terms of what is covered under a CEQA document versus not covered, and then additional CEQA review is triggered. So that is something that we are looking at, and maybe Mike can speak to, because like we said, we take on different roles and a lot of that falls within Mike's shop within the two main CEQA functions.
Yeah, thank you for that, Julia. Now, so as Jillian just noted, I was going to say the same. We do have different functions, 3 different functions actually in CEQA. Some of those come in the context of when another agency has prepared a document, gets that to us when it comes to reviewing air quality. Now that's we focus in on the air quality analysis. When we realize that in looking at those projects that this project will likely come in for a permit, then it takes it to another level called the responsible agency, and we try to get into a little bit deeper. And there we do try to push to make sure that there is some consistency between those project descriptions. I mean, because the closest you can align those project descriptions, the more we can ensure that the CEQA is being satisfied and that the state law is being complied with. So, the more sort of deviation, unfortunately, those things happen, the more problematic that becomes for us to rely on the document or having to do, as I say, some kind of like little supplemental. So we do try to work out those nuances there. And like I said, there are still tools in our toolbox to work with. So things aren't so disastrous, but again, that's what we try to strive for.
Right. And one specific one, I don't want to get into too many details, but as far as understanding your process for CEQA and what your CEQA document covered. So if you have a rule that had certain assumptions in CEQA, and as a person doing CEQA externally, we don't know what your assumptions were, there's this. Yeah, so that did happen. And it's just one of those things as far as if there are some shortfalls, how do we communicate to people doing projects what they need to consider?
And I think this is where the early consultation matters, in terms of that's when we usually ask the questions. And with projects now, we're doing a combined approach. So the early consultation is not just with the CEQA team, but the engineering team is also involved. That way, they're looking at it from the CEQA lens, we're looking at it from the engineering lens and the permit lens, right? So the questions are slightly different, but we raise, issues like, hey, have you thought about this? I know you're putting in this assumption, but based on what we know, maybe you want to, expand that a bit more, because ultimately, when we take a look at the CEQA document that covers an action, right? Sometimes we end up having to put permit limits and conditions to constrain you to what was included in the CEQA document if no further, CEQA document will be prepared. And then, typically when we get to those situations, that's when we sit down with the applicant and we do lay it out there of like, okay, here's where we are. Here's what the document does. Here's now what your permit application asks for. This is where the disconnect is, and here are your pathways forward. Is it a document? Is it another document that has to be prepared, like Mike saying, an addendum or a supplemental? Or are we saying, hey, but if you take these limits to constrain you to what is already covered, we can issue the permit with these limits. So typically that is, it is case by case. We go through the review, the evaluation, and then we discuss. And we do come to the applicant with, here's where we see things. And then it's the conversation of, moving forward.
And sometimes what we've been doing lately in CEQA is like recognizing that it's a challenge sometimes to actually have what your final project is going to look like. There's some business case decisions that need to be made and what have you. And so we try to do on the CEQA side is say, look, if you're kind of, unsure about these things, let's do something in a more worst case scenario under CEQA, because then at least you're covered. So if you're not sure if it's going to be 2 or 3 diesel engines or something or whatever, we use a more worst case analysis scenario. So then you're covered either which way. You can always do that. It doesn't have to be exact, but you got to make sure at least it's covered.
Yeah. And I think we've been looking at this process more holistically lately in order to pull out the streamlining aspects of it, even having check-ins with rulemaking of like, are we good for the projects we already anticipate we're going to be permitting? Are we covered with our CEQA document if we're doing it? And Mike just took the words out of my mouth. Is if you're developing your own document, hit that worst case, try and mention every part of that project you anticipate maybe be constructed, operated, so we can pull from that further down the road for that document. And we don't have to, revisit that document. In terms of some of the disconnect we identified recently is, we don't want to reevaluate documents that have already been evaluated. That's not, helpful, productive, but it's identifying, okay, what is covered by this document. All right.
Thanks.
I see. Thank you for the question. Bill Quinn, you have your hand raised.
Thank you. So I have a question for Julian, Mike. Barbara, you may want to weigh into this. And I'm glad, Chair Delgado, you're here because you might have thoughts on this. So if you wanted to make some changes to CEQA in the law itself. Are there certain points that you think, we're not going to change CEQA drastically, I get that. But are there small areas where you see we could make some minor changes to the law that would help in your permitting process? SEEB has tried, we've sponsored legislation over the years to make some small changes. It's very difficult. And immediately there's a lot of people who feel like we're attacking CEQA and trying to get rid of it. And no, we are supportive of CEQA, but we do think that there's some areas where it can be improved. So I'm curious if any of you have any thoughts on where it could be improved.
This is a tough one.
That was a very
it is.
tough question. I'm already looking at Mike, Jillian, potentially counsel in the room of those opportunities.
Obviously, timing is always the challenge, right? It's always been the bigger issue. But as you can imagine, you recommend reducing that. There's always going to be somebody who says, no, we should actually have more time to review the document. So I think that's probably where there's always been challenges in actually getting CEQA reform in the past. Obviously, you say, hey, ease up on what's expected to be reviewed when it comes to a particular environmental topic area. Well, that's fine and dandy for those that have a problem with that environmental topic area being a barrier. But on the other hand, you have someone who's very interested in that environmental topic area and wants that to maintain. So it's a challenge.
And I was going to say, and this is, open discussion here. If anyone else has any thoughts, I don't want to break open Mike's 2023.
Just chime in.
book. Yeah.
I think it's a precarious question in a lot of ways. We have, our policy is to follow state law as written, and we do have some channels and other committees that look at legislation, but in terms of individual staff positions and ideas like that, it's not not a thing we can easily serve up.
Yeah, but it is a topic we can continue to simmer on. I see Barbara Baird. I'm sorry, that was Brian, our counsel, and Barbara has her hand raised as well.
So there were a couple years ago some efforts at CEQA reform where we did support some of the arguments that were being made, and that went through our legislative committee and everything, so I feel like I can say it. But I think one of the issues that was involved at that time was if somebody files a comment that is past the comment deadline, the current law is it's not a violation of CEQA for the agency to fail to respond to that comment in and of itself. But if that comment raises a valid issue, then and you don't respond to it and correct it or otherwise make it not an issue for your project, then your project can still be set aside even based on a late comment. And so that is, it doesn't come up that often, but when it does come up, it can be a problem.
Well, thank you. I want to say SEEB did sponsor legislation this last year. It did not get through. And Mike, it's kind of on your comment. We were not trying to streamline, but we were trying to get some certainty on timing for infrastructure projects so that when a project proponent went forward, they would have a better idea of how long it would take to get through the CEQA process. And we sponsored that with the building trades, and it did not get through. So we may try again next year. I don't know yet. So.
Now, thank you very much for that. We'll continue to think about that. But if I could ask Barbara, so we supported that. What was the end result of that proposed legislation?
There were a number of CEQA bills that were proposed that year, and they tried to get together and work on one bill, but it didn't happen fast enough, is my recollection.
Thank you. All right. Thank you very much. Do we have any other task force? Oh, I see our chair has raised her hand.
I am really trying very hard to stay in the listening role, but I just wanted to say I'm very concerned as a person or receptive to the question that Bill has and supportive through the appropriate channels, if that's legislative committee or as Barbara alluded to, or I wasn't sure who our other attorney was, but I don't feel comfortable saying more than that in this form.
Yeah, so that was our Assistant Chief Deputy Counsel, Brian Tomasovic.
Okay.
Thank
It really
you.
didn't sound like Bay, and that's who I usually.
No.
Sorry, yes, we have the long tunnel view camera, so thank you, Chair. All right, did we have any other comments from our task force before we open it up?
Real quick one.
Oh, yeah.
More of a action item possibly, as far as, are there any rules that may need a tweak to CEQA? Is there anything that needs to be streamlined? Is there anything on the books for when you adopt CEQA for a rule or rules? There's one in particular I know of, but if there's anything that we could do as far as, hey, there's a glitch in the CEQA that causes grief to permitting, is there opportunities to get that fixed so it will streamline the permitting process? Just throwing it out there, if there's something will be helpful.
No, thank you for that. We'll kind of, I don't think we've ever thought about it in those terms. Not that Mike's workload is light, and we'll get on to
Thank
that
you.
next.
We could talk offline.
But no, yeah, I think maybe we can take that back to the managers and see if there's any particular projects they're working with that are rule specific that are not covered in that aspect, and see if there's maybe other amendments planned or something like that. But yeah, that meshes well with the next agenda item. But
And then,
yeah,
I mean, to add, I think on that point, so far the ones that have come up where we have run into issues, we have been able to work through them.
Mhm.
So, that's where we're going to look for that opportunity of, the workload of doing it. And then what is the reward on the permit end, and so as these issues come up, definitely, please, let's raise them, the early consultation, let's talk about it. And then, the more lead time we have to address something, the more opportunities we have to do something in a timely manner.
And those rules that we are seeing that someone will have to put controls on or something like that with us coming in for a permit for those things, we've been trying to really make sure we hone down that universe, that inventory, the what the equipment would be, what the side impacts, and CEQA's been, really trying to pump up those analyses to make sure we get as much of that information, and we have been able to rely on those documents.
Yes.
So
And to make sure we cover the worst case.
the worst case, of
in
course,
our
yes,
document.
yes.
To cover the activities. And I think that may be something, as I know you're involved with rulemaking, and that is something to consider, is that when you're involved with the rulemaking, understanding that there is a CEQA component to the rule, perhaps, if you have information as to construction impacts and things like that, I think Mike and his team would be, they would welcome that information, because sometimes, we are guessing at some of these impacts. And so any kind of feedback that you can provide, real world feedback of like, hey, no, we need more than one grader, that phase is probably going to last, this long.
Right.
The pad isn't going to be just this small. It's got to be this big.
Right.
Things like that, I think is great information for us.
Yeah, and exactly. I'll expand a little bit on the issue just so everyone understands what we mean. But Jillian mentioned the pad. There was somewhat recent rule where maybe, I guess it was the pad was not sufficient size or didn't account for certain sizes, for construction for control equipment. And so what that does to the permitting process is puts a screeching halt to several projects all at the same time, traffic jam, while we're working that out. So the better we can anticipate all of that, and we have some real world observations and input into the rulemaking, that is where we can really help us. All right, let me jump over to public comment and ask any public members to raise their hand. First in line is Steve Jepson. Steve,
hello, everyone. Thanks for holding this meeting. I find the CEQA discussion interesting, and Steve Jepson with Clean Water SoCal. And of course, our agencies, when constructing water or wastewater projects, we're typically the lead agency as a city or a county or a special district, as David mentioned. And I appreciated Mike Krause's comments on being a little conservative on your assumptions for the CEQA document. And having been part of many CEQA documents over the years, yeah, the CEQA preparer gets information from the engineer who says, I need a 1600 horsepower diesel generator, but then through the design process, it ends up being 1700 horsepower. So it's slightly bigger, and then it's not consistent with the analysis. So anyway, the point of all my rambling is we would be happy to host or work with South Coast to have some CEQA preparation workshops or a workshop just with guidance on good approaches to designing and executing your CEQA document. So you do make some conservative assumptions so things don't have to be revisited. So I'm just extending that offer that we have a lot of CEQA resources within our membership. We could do a workshop where South Coast has some guest speakers, or we could help prepare a larger workshop with South Coast. Just wanted to offer that up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. I know we used to have our quarterly meetings, but I think let's take that back. I'll talk to Mike and Jillian, and that sounds like a very good idea because it helps us. So thank you. All right, next in line, Mike Buckhands. Mike, go ahead.
Thank you, Jason. This is a topic near and dear to my heart as someone who is representing a project that did undergo early consultation, did hire a third party to work on a CEQA document, but yet is in its 12th year of application processing. Streamlining is music to my ears, and we certainly don't have time for me to air 12 years worth of grievances, but I would volunteer our project to try to put into practice some of these streamlining ideas, and then also hearkening back to the thought of making conservative assumptions. I do think that that's all well and good up to the point where it can make a project appear to have a significant impact under CEQA where one would not exist if not for the very worst case. I think that there needs to be a little bit of balance there, recognizing the value in having conservative emission calculations and assumptions. But I would welcome the opportunity to talk with you guys in a separate setting, so I'm not taking up everybody's time. But I'm very glad to hear that this topic is on the table anyway.
All right. Thank you very much, Mike. All right, seeing no other public comments, I think we can, we have a couple items to act on or consider under that. So thank you very much for that. I do want to acknowledge that task force member Judy York is in the room and present. So thank you for coming. So let's move on to item 3. So this is a continued discussion from last time. As I said earlier, we did get pressed for time at our last meeting, but want to allow the task force to continue to discuss any potential thoughts, either for the item we were discussing. We were discussing Rule 441, which is our research operations. I think to summarize some of the discussion we're talking about, this is a 1976 rule. It did not take into account several aspects of permitting, including new source review, toxics, other source specific rules. I think some warning were provided by council in terms of SIP approved rules and what does that mean if we go back. So just wanted to throw it back out for task force discussion with 441. And then if there were other rules where task force had observations, experiences with rule provisions, or I would say maybe even lack of rule provisions, which could help the permitting process and, expanding on that. Often if there's gaps within rules, during permitting is, there is an obligation to ensure there's limits, proper monitoring provisions, record keeping, reporting as part of our permitting duties. But then that brings in, more of a case by case issues for facilities to comply through permitting. So wanted to lay that out as kind of a foundation to continue the discussion. And we have a couple task force hands raised in the room. I'll start with David, and then we'll work down the line.
Thank you. Thanks for revisiting the topic. Just to give an example why I think opening 441 would be helpful is I myself has abandoned a research project of taking biogas to hydrogen because it would take so long to get a research permit. I've had several of my members in the wastewater sector say it's extremely difficult getting a research permit because of all these rules. The idea with the research permit should be to expedite something that needs research, hopefully to clean the air and do something that's advancing technology. But because the rule's so old, you have to comply with all the subsequent rules, and it gets very complex, and it takes almost as long as a regular permit, which I don't think was the intent of having a research permit. So to encourage technology and encourage people to do the right thing, I think we should do something. So that's at least my 2 cents of just dealing with it myself and my members, that it'd be nice to open up the rule and try to find a way to deal with this. And it's not just saying, let people admit whatever they want. It could be a short duration. There's a lot of things that can be done to minimize emissions, but certainly encourage people to research things that would be helpful. So I'll whatever is necessary to encourage that and give you support as far as opening up the rule. But I think that would be very worthwhile. And just tee it up before other people jump in. There's other rules like 431.1 we've talked about maybe opening up, because that's been challenging and causing more of a burden on permitting. Mike, there's other rules that we talk about, but it's just more when we do the rules, is there a way to look at the consequence to permitting and try to say, what do we need to clean the air, but yet make it simple on permitting is the request. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Sorry, Mike, the intent was not to add to your full work.
Oh, don't worry.
But
I have my things to do list. It's fine.
So expanding more really quickly on 441, the one exemption that it did have at the time was an exemption from any Regulation 4 rules, because that was the regulation around in the 1970s. Expanding, you mentioned 431.1. I'm not going to remember the name of the rule, but it's sulfur content, I think, in gaseous fuels. But it's associated what should be the requisite monitoring provisions for certain gas streams.
And my
for
specific
sulfur.
one, some members have exempt facilities that need to do monitoring
Yeah.
according to the rule. So I don't think that was the intent of the rule. Good example of maybe it's worthy of opening up and getting clarity.
Yeah, and I think some of the past discussions through permitting is for rules that were developed in the 90s or earlier did we really foresee the nature of the projects that we're experiencing today? RNG, all the beneficial uses coming out of, biogas. But then also taking into account variability, is there is a high variability of sulfur in these streams, unpredictable, and what is the appropriate monitoring frequency. But thank you very much for adding that in. I will be quiet and keep moving down the line to Judy.
You go first. Okay, I would like to pick up on the issue that was brought up last time regarding incorporating rule requirements into permit conditions before permit issuance and the complexity of that. And for a very long time, we didn't really do that. We would simply, the permit engineer would simply refer to the rule and say, this paint booth is subject to rule 109, or this engine is subject to 1110.2. And that was sufficient. And Jason, you mentioned that EPA has said, no, that's not sufficient. Okay, so if we're gonna deal with this reality of trying to incorporate 10 and 20-page rules into a paragraph in a permit, it's very problematic. And I'll bring up one that was resolved some years ago, but it was a good example. A permit engineer was trying to say this paint booth is subject to Rule 109, which is the daily record keeping requirement, but there's also a monthly option. They ended up, of course, requiring both the daily and the monthly option. Okay. So obviously not what they really intended, but that's what was written. So I think if we're going to go down a path where, I mean, we want streamlining and we want the correct or accurate conditions, it can't be over prescriptive. Every situation's different. We all recognize that. But a very long time ago, there used to be, remember the library of standard permit conditions? I don't know if you guys remember that. Remember that? It was from back, I think, in the 70s or something. But it was, still used into the 80s and 90s. But I think if we want to have conditions in permits that are reflective of rule requirements, I think those have to be well thought out. And there's no sense in having a permit engineer reinvent this every time they're writing a permit. It would be extremely time consuming. And I know on our end, it's extremely time consuming to then try to get the language right. So if this is going to be a requirement, there should be I'm going to say some guidelines and examples. I don't think we want hardcore, policy or, you can't anticipate everything. You can't write the rules with, this going into a permit every time, and every permit's a little different. But certainly there could be very clear guidelines and then examples that are satisfactory to EPA, but not so overboard, on each and every permit engineer trying to craft that correctly. That would be an awful exercise. I wouldn't want to.
No, thank you.
So I think
Go
that's a
ahead.
problem area that needs to be addressed if that's really going to happen. Otherwise, a lot of time is going to be wasted.
To expand on, or you mentioned the EPA audit, which we discussed last time. It was the audit from 2016 where EPA, for the Title V facilities, so we have our minor and we have our major Title V, which EPA reviews those. They explicitly stated no high-level references, to which you indicated, comply with this. That was 2016, but they still hold that. I think even in the past few months, we've gotten at least 3 comments back from EPA. Please expand. If there's a provision and a choice, you have to lock it in. And the reasoning behind that is so the facility knows how to comply, they lock in. Also, the public is aware of what provisions apply. We do have more leniency with our minor source permitting programs, where we do try and exercise that a little bit more. You indicated case by case, because as far as where a condition comes from, it could be a daily backed, it could be an offset, it could be toxics, and even there is a chronic, acute. So the basis for conditions can come from anywhere, because it depends on the facility situation at that particular time, and also their business strategies, what's important for them. So that's some of the things that come into permit conditions, and I think we're going to be talking about that later too.
And it could also involve alternate operating scenarios, right?
Yes.
EPA allows that. So, okay, if we're doing this, it's this one. If we're doing that, it's this other one. So it can get fairly unnecessarily complex, but
yes,
okay.
And we were actually just one of the managers, we were just talking about this morning is, yes, we do have recent templates, permits that have been issued. It's not always, a square peg that fits into a square hole that we use, but it's trying to brainstorm. And we're actually talking about maybe bringing this up to the task force of mechanisms to build a library searchable database.
I think you have to have a library. Yeah, I think that's where it's got to go, to a searchable library that's open to the public, that people can, a preparer can look at and go, okay, here's the best one. Let's, propose this, and then maybe have that discussion if that's not sufficient, but we shouldn't be crafting each shoe from scratch. We should start with some good templates that have been used and approved, and then, building on them.
Yeah, thank you. And it is something we've been working on. Our contractors are working on a template for laser cutting. I think that's done. I know I keep saying almost done, but it is truly in its final stages. I know our waste management team have been working on some.
I think for these rules, it would be a little different database, not just, okay, this is laser cutting and all the conditions and we've dialed it all in, but okay, for rule 1110.2, here's what we need to capture, some guidance, what we need to capture in these conditions. If there's a limit, that needs to be stated. If there's monitoring, that needs to be stated. What is it we have to achieve in that condition? And then simply a library of conditions that are tied to the rule requirements that are being tagged then. So, okay, maybe this is one that's going to get put in a laser cutter, but maybe it's the same, principles. Say rule 109, go back to my rule 109, a paint booth, a solid cleaning operation, whatever, it could be that same condition that's been, applied. And then it's familiar to people and people know what to do. The more consistency we have, the better people understand what to do.
Yeah, agreed.
And I think that that's definitely something we're looking forward to with the permit processing handbook and these chapters as we are developing them now. We're looking at consistency is one, right? And making sure everyone understands, why is this condition in here? What are you trying to get at? Which requirement? And we've held off on it because we were waiting for 1445. And then making sure that we wrapped in what was current, what was being proposed there to drive why we have standard conditions. Because I think, as we noted before, there was inconsistency with regards to how we were permitting this equipment across the different teams. So once we realized that, that was, the driver of let's get the consistency so everyone has the same expectation when you come in for a permit of, what am I going to see in my conditions? What is it going to address? What are the emission factors? How am I going to be assessed, or how is the equipment going to be assessed to give, that expectation for you in terms of what you're going to see?
Right. But I would say, don't be afraid of starting small, even if it's a website with 3 paragraphs that say conditions have to be on permits. Here are our principles. And then maybe you only have 10 conditions you start with. Just start with that. Just get the ball going, because I think if you wait for perfection, it will be a very long time, And you can start small. It's okay.
No, thank you for that. Yeah, we had been thinking about it, but do appreciate the input, especially as we have new staff and making those resources available.
That's a really big deal of just trying to get road conditions in the permits.
All right, and we'll move down the line to Bill Pierce.
So I just wanted to follow, actually, both of these I wanted to follow up on. With respect to R&D permits, so we have done R&D permits over the years, and it's basically, and this is with discussions with senior staff, but basically we've always ended up just getting a regular permit. And then evaluated based on the length that the project was going to be short term. But the bottom line is they said basically it was going to take virtually the same amount of time to do it either way. And so we just took the normal permitting steps. I mean, it's something for the normal permitting route. But if something could be done to improve that, or maybe, and it might not be possible because of there's so many new rules in place now versus when we used to try and run these through. But yeah, if something can be looked at that with respect to improving that process, that would be useful, because some things we just end up not even looking at just because of the time involved to getting the initial permit. So we just shifted to a different location where they can easily pull a permit. So, and then with respect to rule requirements in permits, I mean, so we've had this issue off and on. I mean, the district does on occasion make improvements to the rules that benefit us, but sometimes we end up having rule provisions locked into a permit, and so we end up having to revise the permit after the rules revise. So just an additional step, not being able to take advantage. And I will say several of those cases was for our Title V facility. So I mean, and so there might not have been a way around that, but right, the more that goes into a permit with respect to specific rule requirements, it's just a potential for down the road that if something occurs that means a change, and then the rule may change, but then we can't take advantage of it until the actual permits also change. And so that would, and with respect to the database for permit conditions, I mean, that would be and I would take it from the standpoint, especially with all the new staff the district has working on, because a lot of times the engineers are saying they don't think they can do something, but then I give them something from a couple of years ago or 3 years ago. Well, this is how it was laid out in this permit. and so it's, but they don't, and I don't know how your internal search engines work or things like that. But I mean, so basically we just show them how it was done previously, and then they can go research it. But it's just, if there was a more vibrant library available for them to look at, that might ease up some of the searching that goes on all the time.
Yeah,
on their side of the house.
Definitely agreed. That is, well, I would say it's one component of the PEP program of going back and looking at the software, redeveloping it that we use for permit processing. Some of these permits are very old, but it's bringing it to current day and then maybe utilizing that to identify those conditions. That's one of the longer term PEP items that we're working on. So definitely, agree that there's opportunity there to build some consistency by making it available to everyone.
And for us, sometimes it's not so much as consistency, but a lot of our permits are more out of the box. And so they might not lend themselves more to standard type conditions per se, but they were developed, I mean, with the district. And so we like to think that they can be utilized, as long as the underlying regulations haven't changed, that they can be utilized in follow-on permits.
Thank you. We pause. Was there any other task force members that wish to discuss an item before we go to public comment? Seeing none, I do see one hand raised. Oh, more than one hand raised. Let's start with Natasha Mescal.
Natasha Mescal with Ecotech. My concern was similar to Bill's. If we put conditions reflecting the detailed permit rule requirements compliance, I see that as creating problems when the rule changes. But how about some kind of in-between approach I also love the idea of library of conditions that is publicly available. That would allow all the applicants to make sure that they pre-screen that they can comply with it before submitting permit application. So my suggestion would be to think about creating the library of permit conditions that can be detailed and could reference the detail of the current rule compliance, which if the rule is changed, it can just be updated on one spot and it's applicable immediately from now on. But on the other hand, the permit to stay to refer to the specific rule compliance instead of the details.
Thank you very much, Natasha, for that comment. Let's move up or move down rather to next commenter, Rita Loof. Rita, go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning. Rita Loof, Director of Environmental Affairs for RATTEC International. And my comment is related to the discussion on the complexity of permit conditions. Currently, there are several rules being amended that may negatively impact the streamlining efforts of this task force. And I wanted to raise them to your attention. They are 1151 automotive coatings, 1136 wood coatings, 1124 aerospace coatings, and 1107 metal coatings. In addition to the record-keeping requirements of Rule 109, these rule proposals require a multitude of additional records. So given Jason's comments earlier about the EPA requirements for Title V facilities and the specificity that's needed in permit conditions, presumably there will be permit conditions that go along with these additional requirements. So this would result in an exponential increase of permit conditions. RATTEC is strongly opposed to adding additional burdens to permittees, but I'm curious to hear if the task force staff is looking at this issue and how increasing the complexity of permit conditions will impact permit streamlining efforts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rita. We have numerous meetings on these coding rules because of the nature of them and also because of the toxic component to these proposals. Off the top of my head, and I don't know, Mike, if you know which additional record-keeping provisions there are. I think at a minimum, I think our compliance team is a part of these meetings as well. But I think we can at least take a look at it.
I'll take a look. But I mean, I'm on the surface, I recognize, of course, that record keeping is a critical enforcement tool, especially when dealing with area sources and things like coding. So, it's not that we can let that kind of go away. That is an important element. We did add what is additional, however, on this is reporting. And the reason for that is because of the inventory, getting a real proper inventory of the coatings that are out there. And even in the case of what Rita's, of her industry, is to really reflect some of the achievements that have been out there, the lower VOC usages that are out there. And we just feel that it's really important to have that data. Now, that reporting is every 5 years, so we think that that's not too burdensome in that time frame. But we also recognize the importance of kind of building that inventory and showing that. So as we continue on.
And to expand on that, we wouldn't go and reissue permits for something like that if someone was going through permitting at the time. It would be a division, but we're not seeking to go and reissue and create additional workload for that provision.
That's right.
All right. Well, thank you, Rita. We'll continue to assess that. All right. Seeing no other hands raised,
Jason, any
Go.
follow-up as far as action items, as far as bringing
Yeah.
anything back? While Mike's here, we could always assign something.
Yeah, so I did.
Sitting right here.
Thank you for reminding me, because I did write down, I think, definitely for Rule 441, I think, internally, with staff is let's talk about that. I think we've already indicated Mike's growing workload.
That's fine.
But I think there is opportunity we at least need to assess the opportunity of maybe
It's up to you.
streamlining
You know
this.
what your staff is working
Yes.
on, how much time it
Yeah.
takes. If there's opportunities
Yep.
to make it easier, it
Right.
may be a good opportunity to make a rule change, hopefully simplistically, maybe painful, but there's a reason for it.
Yes, and I think it's definitely notable if the current requirements are deterring facilities from seeking research, which may be beneficial in some cases.
Certainly,
for
there
air
are cases I
quality.
could, give to you saying, here's why it's necessary.
Right. So I think let's take that back and we'll bring it back to the task force, seeing where we can go with this in timelines, and also discuss with council on impacts there. But I think we hit on something here that could be beneficial. But no, really appreciate you bringing it to for discussion. And then, as you mentioned, the other rule, 431.1, we've been talking about that internally of appropriateness of that rule language. So we'll mix that in as well with our discussions. But thank you very much and for reminding me. I did have that to bring it up in the updates at the end. All right, so moving on to rule item 4. Let me do a quick time check. We're at 11:30. We're moving along. I did want to briefly touch on a new rule, Rule 317.1. And what we're not going to cover in this is the notification procedures to where facilities will find out if they are subject to fees that will be is being assessed by our planning division. But what we wanted to touch on is to start the streamlining efforts of what to expect if someone wants to, if they are able to and eligible to get out of rule applicability and exit 317.1 and how to go about it, what the criteria is we're looking at. We did detail this in the staff report in 317.1, so I will just simply be referencing those items, but wanted to bring it up for everyone to start talking about. And we're also going to be bringing this to a future permit working group meeting to go into further detail. But it's early in the process. We want the information out there so facilities can start discussing this, and then hopefully also we can avoid a last minute panicked rush of when facilities are making those business decisions, is give them a little more time to discuss with us and do the things they need to do to meet those criteria. So I will jump into this a little bit and open it up for discussion if there's any questions on this, but this does affect major sources of emissions. It does not mean a facility has to be in Title V or have a Title V facility permit to be subject to this. It could be actual emissions that trigger it outside of it, or a potential to emit under your permit, but you've otherwise taken a condition to keep out of Title V program. So I see some nodding heads of some realizations here. This is very detailed on the permitting side, so I'll try and keep it light, but this is why we want people to go back and look. So if a facility does get a notification that they might be in and they want to see maybe they're a low emitting facility, it's from production that has from years ago that they were permitted and they no longer use, a facility will need to decide, do they wish to come in to modify whatever may be that brings them in to establish new limits in their permits or a 317.1 plan to lock them in so they won't be in. And what this is we'll be looking at the annual emissions reporting for the last 5 years. This will be very consistent with our Title V exclusion process. But if a facility has been less than 80% of the major source thresholds and been reporting that for the last 5 years, then they can submit a plan application to lock them in at below major source thresholds for their actual emissions. Don't worry, and we're going to be expanding on this a lot more because it is a lot. If a facility is in Title V, they can still get a 317.1 exclusion. And it will just be a plan application plus a Title V revision application. We wish to keep this simple, and it will have the record keeping requirements and the emission limits for the facility in that plan. If you are not in the Title V universe, then it's just the plan application. What we do ask and will be requiring is that any facility who is amending their annual emission reports to do that before coming into the application process, because that will cause delays. And we want all this locked in before we're evaluating it, rather than applications sitting in the inventory becoming backlogged that we can't act on. So if a facility does not meet that criteria of the 80% below major source thresholds, there still is opportunity, but now you're looking at your permitted potential to emit. And if you want to give up that equity, I'll call it, of those emissions to reduce your permit limits. It is possible that a facility may want to come out of Title V at the same time. That is a different process, which applications will be required for each permitted piece of equipment. That will be more involved in a longer process. But we want to identify for 317.1, we've identified, and put in this quick mechanism for facilities that have very low annual emissions, have demonstrated it, and we can process these very quickly. I would say at this early process, if you know already that you're going to be in and you're interested in being excluded, you think you're eligible, contact us. And we can sit down and walk through your facility, what you have, in our system, and give a facility information to build your strategies of how you want to handle that, what's available to you, and those different paths, and get those applications in. So I want to reiterate again is make sure your AERs are representative and complete before coming into this application process. We will be expanding on this in more detail in a date to be determined, but most likely October in the permit working group, because I think a lot of people are going to have a lot of questions on this and we want to go through it. But I will pause there and allow everyone to ask questions on this. And then also make sure we have everything covered on what to anticipate, but all in the interest of getting through this anticipated workload and doing so in a timely manner. So I do see for a task force, one hand raised in the room. Bill Pierce.
So the only question, just a quick question, but the only question I've been asked about this is if taking a new PTE, so getting below the threshold. So will you be able to drop just below the threshold, or do you have to go to 80%? And the second part of the question they asked was, will EPA, how receptive the EPA is going to be for processing these applications, or if there's any potential roadblocks?
Okay, so for Title V purposes, and I'll look to staff as I say this, but I believe we've been putting conditions to stay just below the thresholds, the 10 ton per nox. Depends what the pollutant is, that you stay below, that, not the 80%. You would have to show some reasonable evidence that that is realistic. That you're not just, we would still evaluate that we
Right.
would expect compliance with that before processing. But that is typically what the Title V exclusion, and then also we're thinking a similar but different route for 317.1 is, but now it's your actual emissions would stay below that threshold. In terms of EPA, this will be if you're already in Title V and stay in Title V, this will be a plan application that will be part of the Title V permit. It would be a commitment to keep your annual emissions down below a threshold. I do not anticipate any issues. We did have lots of discussions with EPA in development of this rule. I think what I can do is at least take that back and have confirming conversations with the permitting side at Region 9 to make sure we're on the same page before the permit working group meeting. But again, I don't anticipate anything because it is bringing emissions down, potentials down, not,
Right.
sometimes not even actual.
That was the question that was asked of me, so.
Right.
Thank you.
All right. No, thank you. I got 3 bills in a line. Our 3 musketeers. Next up is Bill Quinn.
Thank you, Jason. So I know this is early in the process, but I was wondering if you've done any preliminary evaluation to see the quantities of permit applications you might get for this effort. And just in planning your workload supply, do you think this is going to be hundreds or tens or 1,000? Any idea?
I do not anticipate it will be thousands. I would say, okay, so our Title V universe is 315 facilities.
Something like that, yeah.
So that's a known. For those, I don't know, comparing actual, it really is the business decision. For those we've excluded and might still have a high potential to emit, I would say another maybe few hundred. I'm looking at we're all kind of nodding in agreement. It is, so that's kind of our cap, our worst case. Not everyone's going to be eligible for this because we do have large emitter facilities that need to, for their processes, emit over those thresholds. It's not reasonable for them to be excluded, and they'll most likely seek other emission reduction opportunities to lower their impacts. I can see this being anywhere from a dozen to several dozen, It really is dependent on the facilities and what they wish to give up in their permits to avoid these fees. It is an avoidance mechanism, which is part of a permitting process. Sometimes you don't wish to trigger compliance provisions, whatever it may be. In this case, it's fees, but it would be for already low emitting facilities or facilities that wish to commit to that low emission. So it's hard to tie it down because facilities are going to have to make their decisions. But again, we want to identify this early so we can have those discussions and be available for facilities to make those decisions.
Thank you.
Yeah. And keep it simple while we're doing it, hopefully. All right. Thank you very much. Bill Lamar.
Thank you, Jason. Just so I'm clear on this, if a facility, Title V facilities, chooses this option, do they have to reduce their emissions by 80%? Or I thought I heard you say actual emissions.
Yes. So what we're established, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, which is it? If 80% is slightly higher or somewhat higher than actual, that would give them a little bit of wiggle room. I'm thinking about a facility that maybe with coming out of COVID and everything like that, and uncertainties in supply chains and the economy, they gradually or suddenly get a project or some projects. If it's actual that they're not going to be able to either to bid on or to handle without reverting back into Title V again.
Yes, and that is the decision. So what we're looking at to start to evaluate these is for actual emissions is for the past 5 years. So we have reasonable assurance that this is a low emitting operation with respect to major source thresholds at 10 ton per year NOx, VOC. We ask that their annual emission reports show that they're below, that would then be an 8 ton threshold. Again, it's going to be up to a facility and their past operations, their planned operations, on whether this is a feasible route for them to be excluded from 317.1. Title V is another mechanism. You can be excluded from 317.1 and still have a Title V permit, but you're committing to keep those actual emissions down each year to below major source thresholds. Permitting wise, you still have that equity there if you wish to go in. So that's what we're looking at. If somebody wishes to, all at once want to get out of Title V because of all the requirements that we've discussed today that come along with that, and all the public participation for permitting, everything, that is a separate road. It would also count for 317.1. You need to keep your annual emissions below that, but it is a more involved permitting process up front. But then a facility would lose that equity in the potential to emit. We can't make that decision for a facility. We can make ourselves available and give the lay of the land for facilities to make that decision. So it is complex because, as you can imagine, for a facility with 1 or 2 pieces of equipment, this may be simple. For lots of devices, it's going to be complex. So I hope I addressed your question in there, but please ask other questions if you have more.
No, I think you probably answered it as best you can. I'm just not sure that some businesses can plan. There are certain things that that you just can't plan for, and some of that can be maybe a windfall where the economy is on the upswing, and your product is whatever it is more in demand, and here you're going to be left out of this because you've taken what in all reality a cap on your emissions.
Yes, it is a risk calculation for the facility. I will add, if you commit to this cap, there is still opportunity if facility wishes to grow and expand, but it is the consequences and all the triggers in the permitting mechanisms that come along with it for growth. Emission reduction credits, triggering backed. I can go on and on, but it is the typical provisions we have for making sure we're making continued progress for our air quality goals. But yes, from a facility perspective, this will be a very difficult risk calculation, but we can commit to providing all the information that we have, through the permit engineers to hopefully make it a little bit clearer.
Thank you, Jason.
All right. Thank you, Bills. Appreciate it. Do we have, I want to open it up for public comment on this item before we move on. Do we have any public comment on this? I don't see any, but again, there will be another opportunity in a permit working group where we had originally planned it to be, for waste management operations, but there's some things we wanted to move up for discussion, and we will be discussing that hopefully at the end, near the end of October. We'll be announcing that soon. I don't see any. So let's move on. I do want to do a time check because we are scheduled to end at 12, but let's see where the discussion takes us. And I think we can commit that, we'll acknowledge that this is going to be a very long discussion. Maybe we can identify high-level issues and commit to bringing it back so we can use the time we have for this to move forward. But I want to hand it over. This is an item that was brought up by David Rothbart, albeit many different topics on permit conditions consolidated into one. But why don't I hand it over to you? And
You took the words out of my mouth as far as how much time we have. We could get into details on this some other time, but I think what we talked about earlier may be a good focus as far as standardized conditions. As Judy's talking about a library, kind of gets to the gist of the dilemma here of, what I've seen, what my members see is we have very complex conditions. They keep getting more complex. There's inconsistencies between rule writers and reading the rules, and you probably get 10 people in the same room reading the same rule and come up with a different opinion on what to do. And then it gets into permitting. So it gets very complicated. So something that standardizes that as much as possible should make it easier for someone requesting a permit to know what they're getting and be easier on the permit writer to know what to draft up. So I think figuring out some way to move forward on that would be really useful. And to the extent we could simplify things, and we talked about how much detail needs to go into a rule condition or condition of permit that references a rule. It used to be saying, follow this rule. I know we can't do that specifically, but to the extent you can make it more generic, it will save you a lot of hassle in the future. Whenever we have any new rule coming up, what do we do to amend the permits? You have something in a rule, we have to amend a permit and add more permits to revise. If there's something that's more self-sustaining, that would be a lot easier on the permitting process. So I think whatever we could do to start standardizing things and simplifying things would be very helpful. And you teed it up at the last board meeting as far as the use of AI. Actually, I have one of my members playing around with that to some degree. And if you actually have a repository of knowledge for AI to look at and say, here's my standardized conditions, you could spit out a draft permit instantly for engineers review. So once we have something that's a little functional, we can share it with you as far as a concept. But the technology is out there. It's a matter of just programming the rules and conditions and policies into something to help you draft something up. It's not taking away the job of an engineer. It's making their life easier, more consistent.
Yeah. And I think, let me start with the last one to expand on, and detail we couldn't talk about or it wasn't appropriate for the board meeting, but yeah, we have been talking about it. I think with and this is down the line, we need to talk to Ron and our IM department, but with written rules, the library of permits and equipment categories, this wouldn't be replacing engineers, but coming into a process is developing a base template evaluation, with the data for that, maybe a specific facility even, and then potential draft conditions. We've already talked about the libraries bringing this all together, but it would be, potentially maybe move the starting line further down the process for an engineer to start reviewing, and then, still making the common sense checks, bringing this into reality, but not having to write the evaluation. We don't start from scratch on every evaluation. Typically facility history, everything, rule write-ups are taken. We don't reinvent the wheel on these. But can we expand on that even more? And then, like you said, it frees up engineers' time to do other things, to do more permit evaluations. So this is something as we go through, it won't, can't commit to doing in PEP in the next year. But I think as we move past PEP, the next things, it is definitely something firmly on our radar of how to use it. I think even today we were talking about all our systems and how they talk to each other. Compliance, annual emission report we've talked about today, and now that is now coming into permitting future NSR reform. When we end up with that, there's a opportunity here with that. In terms of standardizing it, staff wise, that is something we're utilizing the contractors for right now. We'll continue to. And I think it's also making more information available to our contractors and, adding to our permitting handbook.
I'd say something that maybe this group would be useful for as a sounding board as far as standard conditions. So I understand as a regulator, my agency regulates parks too. So I understand as a regulator, you want to make sure you have contingency and make sure the person discharging does something that you want them to do, and you tend to have a lot of specificity. But this group could look at it as like, do you really need to go to that level of detail? What can we put in a permit condition to make it simple and straightforward rather than adding to it? If you look at the permits from 10 years ago, a couple pages long. Now we have permits that are, how long they get. They get very long. Do we need that level of detail? Do we need to specify, my example is a pump. Pumping water has nothing to do with emissions. Do we need to have that specificity? If you start changing that pump, I need a permit revision for something that has nothing to do with air emissions. So we're making it so complicated, you're going to have more need to revise permits for what benefit? And you're taking away staff time that could otherwise be doing things to reduce their emissions. So it's sort of that perspective of, can we do something efficient to get permits going faster?
Yeah. And typically, we do instruct engineers to not look at the detail that doesn't affect the permit, but then again, still identifying the permit unit. In some cases, a pump can affect air quality and emissions, or be part of a certified system that we need to look at. So we do that, but this is something we're diving into more. Actually, we did do this in the last permit working group meeting. Is we presented a new standardized condition to bring in, the feedback. We did this based on what we've been experiencing in permitting and compliance issues. It was related to our nuisance rule because of what our compliance team has been experiencing. And we did open it up for feedback of, are we considering everything as we standardize these conditions before we start plopping it into permits and then having to react after the permit has been issued. So I think, there's great opportunity, I think, for working group to have that in-depth discussion on specific permit conditions and templates. So I see Judy.
I would just maybe reflect back to I would be careful with the standardized conditions, because then people feel like we have to use this one, even though it's this long. And in this case, we only need this simple one. I would maybe stick more with examples that you love, that then standard, because that language then, especially for a young permit engineer, they're going to go, oh, I have to use that one. And if you remember in the old examples in that old permitting handbook, they would have multiple standardized conditions, but there would be multiple of them. I don't know if they were standardized, but multiple of them because some fit in some cases and others fit in other cases. There are lots of different cases. So you want to empower and not limit, I guess. So where the words you use because people will take it,
I completely agree because we recently tried it for 431.1 of a standardized condition. And then you run into the wall of
Right.
individuality with facility,
There's
circumstances, and
always
resources. as well.
other good situations, maybe even a research permit where, okay, we can't, do it this way, but we can do it this way.
Yeah, definitely noted that I guess it would be more of a guidance.
Right.
There's something, it may not be just exact, but something you can
Right.
plan your project around.
Right. And then this one's tried and true is going to be familiar to everybody and it's going to go well. But it's an example. And if we need to tweak it a little for some specific situation, we can do it.
Right. Just facility discussion. I just want to make sure that any task force members have, and I'll bring it back because I think we want to kind of plan out our next discussion a little bit more, but why don't I open it up to public comment? I see a couple hands raised. Let me do that and then we'll bring it back as far as looking ahead on this item. So let me open it up and Natasha Mescal, you have your hand raised.
Thank you very much, Natasha Mescal. So my personal biggest priority would be to look into standard conditions that are kind of setting up situations for non-compliance in the future. First and foremost, Rule 1401 standard condition. I submitted many comments since 1994 in regards to that. We started as Rule 1401 says that if it's below screening level, it's okay. Standard permit condition used to say you cannot use anything except what has been evaluated. From the Rule 1401 as amended at the time of application was deemed complete. We got a little better. Now it says you cannot use any cancerogen that has not been evaluated during permit application. Could we please say you cannot use any 1401 compounds that exceed screening levels? And we can specify which screening levels. AQMD has a beautiful calculator that takes into account, cumulative effect of multiple toxic pollutants. So I think that keeping standard condition is excluding everything like a trace of toxics in the new materials that were not available at the time of permit application is setting up facilities for non-compliance. So I'm appealing greatly, please reevaluate the standard condition. And second, I would concur with already mentioned, please do not put the characteristics of the equipment descriptions that do not affect the emissions into the permit description. So my fan broke, I don't know, I had 5 horsepower, now 4 horsepower is good because it's more efficient. I have same airflow resulting from it, but if this happened, I have to modify my unnecessary expense and unnecessary effort required from you, from AQMD, as well as the applicants. So these were kind of 2 main ones. I mean, there is this subject, we could have a meeting only on that one, but I would greatly appreciate it if you could take just these 2 comments into consideration.
All right, thank you very much on the 1401. On the first part of that, let us take it back. Something that comes to mind is inspectors that have to enforce these. Because if there were to be screening levels, then there would need to be record keeping for each of those compounds rather than the current prohibition we have right now. But let me at least commit to looking at that because it might create additional workload for other teams.
If I may suggest possible solution for that concern, you have a beautiful toxic calculator. Put in a condition, you have to prove with your toxic calculator that any toxics from the rule that was in power when your application was considered complete are not exceeding specific screening levels.
Thank you for that. We'll definitely take that back. All right, moving on. Our next commenter is Kevin Cosgrove. Kevin, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was having a hard time unmuting. Yeah, I love the idea of standardized permitting or permit language conditions, but one concern I have is that very often we'll have something spelled out as a standard, and then we don't have any backup of how they got to that standard. You know, very often it's one of the things you can do is look at the backup and figure out whether that's applicable to your situation. So the backup, be it condition, what they're assuming, or emission factors and things like that, need to be addressed like in a reference to the given conditions. It would really be helpful as far as being able to analyze things and figure out whether you could use it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, some sort of discussion of how we got there with the library, but I think it's all kind of things we have to brainstorm about. So thank you for that. I don't see any other hands raised. I did want to bring it back to the task force members really quick and maybe come up with homework items for us to think about when we bring this back. And we're looking at the December timeframe right now for task force before the holidays. Something we maybe need to consider, because from this perspective, hundreds of equipment categories, lots of rules, is maybe coming up with maybe types of equipment, types of rules that would help to look at first the permit conditions. You know, we have the concept of this consultants working on handbook chapters of what should we move forward with first. I think you all have your own realm of expertise.
I guess, but I mean, I know there's personal preferences, but I mean, I guess treat it the same as you're treating how you're developing your online application process, which I thought you're looking at the most significant groups of equipment for that task. And so maybe that's appropriate for that type of work also.
What are the most common permit conditions that need to go on permits? To start with those. 109, prohibitory rules. You know, you've got probably about 10 or 15 rules that are really common. Start with those. That's the low-hanging fruit.
All right, thank you.
And just think of it as a condition library of examples for those, and then just start with that. And what are the principles? What is it EPA said we need these things to be in the conditions? And clarify it's for major sources versus minor sources, so that permit engineers doing it understand that difference.
Right.
Everyone else, yeah.
Thank you. I think we can build on that. We'll have that chapter done by the next time, so maybe we can continue to talk about this. What comes to my mind, but I wanted to hear from everybody, is engines is always one where that probably one of the most commonly permitted
Emergency
pieces of equipment.
engines, even your gas stations,
yes.
your paint booths.
One of the ones we got the most discussions on.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's very complex rules that get associated with it. But can we simplify it? So, okay, I think we'll commit to have this being an ongoing topic. Maybe we can further refine some of the subtopics under this. As I said, David Rothbart brought forth a number of items under permit conditions that we can continue to talk about, and we can bring back some of this in our next meeting. But thank you for all of this. And we're not too much over on time. But first, before we move on, I did want to move on to item 6 with updates. I did have some updates of coming things, and then we'll ask the task force if they have any updates as well. But looking ahead, I did also want to identify that our health risk assessment tool that we briefly presented in the governing board meeting, we're targeting to release that on November 1st. That has all the new meteorological data with it. And so this will be our next installment of, you're used to the attachments with our health risk assessment procedures. This is the next one in that, but it's built within this tool. So everyone will be moving towards this new tool. Before then, I mentioned there's going to be a permitting working group in October. We're going to be diving into the detail of how to use this, what it does. We've also been looking at the factors for E85 gas stations. There's sub-modules built into this for mobile fuel orders, E85 gas stations. So we'll be walking through all of that and giving everybody an opportunity to see the walkthrough of how this works and how it can benefit everybody. We had originally committed, as I said, to have our next permitting working group meeting be focused on waste management operations. We're gonna have to push that out a little bit because of more pressing needs to get this tool out to make sure everyone knows how to use it, knows where to direct their questions, and make sure everyone's on the same page on that. And there was another item we were going to talk about. I just forgot. I said it during this meeting and I'm blanking. I'll come back to it. But for our next task force meeting in December, mentioned the permit conditions. We're also going to get into change of ownership guidelines and the guidance associated with that. We're redeveloping it. Thank you very much, Jillian. The other topic for the working group was 317.1, going through in more detail on that item. And then also want to reiterate for everyone, we're still want to keep it open. If there's anyone interested in becoming a new task force members, we've gotten a few inquiries. I want to continue to build up that group before we move forward with approval on those task force members. We have an ongoing list, but if you know anyone who would be a good task force member, or you yourself feel you can contribute and want to be at the table for these items, we do appreciate everyone's time, but please submit your name to either myself or Rula. That's information's on the agenda. You can email us. And then for some action items, we're going to take back some rule ideas, some of the CEQA discussions we had to bring back, and we'll keep talking about that. But with that, I wanted to open it up if task force had any other updates they wish to provide under this item. Seeing none, did we have any public comment on that? I didn't see any hands raised on that. And then now we will move to our general public comments. Did anybody have any other public comments to discuss before we adjourn? I see one from one of our task force members. We'll start with that. Bill Quinn, go ahead, and then we'll move over.
Yeah, Chair Delgado, thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate your focus on this issue. It's one of our key issues, and it's really nice to have you participate. Thank you.
It's exciting to see all the topics that were discussed.
Thank you as well, Chair. You get to see some of the nitty gritty behind permitting. I don't always get to talk about with you.
Yeah, I have to admit I didn't understand half of it, but really excited about what this task force can do.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, we'll move over to our attendees. Natasha Mescal. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was waiting for unmute sign. Could you add update on the progress of the tool to supply electronically permit application for common or simpler permit application that will pre-screen a lot of the things before it reaches you? So they can make sure, an applicant can make sure that AQMD reach complete data to start with.
So just to expand on your comment, is it for the electronic applications?
Yes, like a smart application submittal tool.
Okay, yeah, definitely. If you haven't already, I would look at the September board meeting and the video we presented there. That would be the September, it's only been a few weeks, September 6th board meeting, where we presented a video on some of those efforts. And then we're going to be continuing to develop that and also providing regular updates. So we might be maybe for December or maybe the task force meeting after that. One of those two, we can present progress on where we are with that. Also, I believe last task force meeting, and the date escapes me, but you can find it on our webpage. We talked a lot about what this, we did a walkthrough of the electronic permit applications. So this will be an ongoing item, but wanted to provide you those resources in the meantime. But thank you, and yeah, we'll continue to report on that. All right, and I see one other item, Daniela Tabor.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I'm not sure if this is the appropriate place to ask, but I was wondering how this is going to affect CPP exams.
Yes, that is something that is one of our permit enhancement items. We discussed that, I believe it was 2 task force meetings ago. We got some very good input from our task force members that we're currently evaluating. So before we move forward with any of those, we're still, eyeball deep and trying to rethink this program, but we will be coming back to the task force as far as our PEP commitments, because there is opportunity to enhance CPP. I think a lot of what we heard back was the feedback loop on that. So this is the forum for that. It will be on future agendas, but that's where we're at, is we're evaluating what ongoing testing looks like, how we give CPPs feedback on their submitted permit applications, and how to really make this work better for everybody.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, but continue to be part of this forum, and we will get to that. Probably not in the next one, maybe the one after that, but we'll signal it beforehand. All right. Thank you. That concludes public comment. Want to thank everyone once again for your time, thoughts, ideas. We're getting there. It's going to take a while, but really appreciate the ideas for us to build on and make things, a lot more streamlined for the entire process. And also want to thank you, Mike, for coming in and contributing as well. And Chair, once again, thank you for all the support through the permanent enhancement program as well. All right, great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. Great job.
That concludes the meeting, and October working group meeting, December task force. See you all then.
David, you're supposed to assign things to people who have left the meeting.